So today's video is comparing various different ports of the very awesome arcade game R-Type, which released by irem back in 1987. Now, a lot of people's got very good fond memories of this game through visuals alone. One of the things which actually attracted me to this game back in the day, and still does, is the awesome neon colours. So of course, just like any other popular arcade game from back in the day, it would have various ports on microcomputers, on consoles. Now, we're looking at several different versions of R-Type. This is for the original 1987 game, so anything which was created Super Nintendo wise, such as Super R-Type, is not going to be included because they're not actually the same game. Having said that, we do have some Nintendo systems in here, and even ZX Spectrum. There are some very good ports of R-Type, and this one was very hard to judge, to establish, to me personally, which version of this got the best version. So here we go. So first off in this list, we have got the Amstrad CPC version of R-Type. This one was released in 1989. As you can see, this game is ultra slow, lots of lag going on, and of course old hardware has limitations, but from my experience of Amstrad CPC gaming, there's a hell of a lot better than this port, and Amstrad CPC is much more capable of this. As you can see from the colours and the graphics, it almost looks like a very cheap port of the ZX Spectrum version, which we'll get to soon. There's no music in the CPC version of R-Type. The sound effects are very bland, like I say, very laggy, and the controls wasn't too responsive either. Very slow to play, and like I said before, the CPC was much more capable of this. Next up, we have got the Atari ST port of R-Type, and this one released back in 1988, so the same year as the arcade game itself. I think Atari actually had a heads up with this game. So I think there are slight latency issues with the controlling in this game. Visuals for the game, sprites, everything else are very average for a 16-bit micro game. Music only and no sound effects by the seams of it from the first stage I've played. I did find that the sprites in the game were actually too big, and as you can see from the gameplay footage, it was moving so fast. So combined with having very large sprites, the game itself is moving so quickly, it was just very hard to play, and it's also slightly laggy. So yeah, for Atari ST fans, I'm sure this isn't good news, but I do have my reasons for rating this one this low in this list. Next up, we have got the original classic Game Boy. This one actually released back in 1991, so a few years after the arcade machine released. Now, something I need to respect with this version is that, of course, this is monochrome and it's got limitations. It's portable for starters, but having said that, some portable games, some are even better than actual console versions sometimes, and this one's no exception. The music and the sound effects in this port for the Game Boy is really good. Sprites are much smaller, and some have actually been taken away. It's got very good smooth scrolling with occasional flicker and very slight slowdown. Like I said in introduction, R-Type has got many good ports on it. The only reason I've ranked this one this low down, because quite literally it does have some slowdown. Next up, we have got the ZX Spectrum port of R-Type. This one released in 1988, so the same year as the arcade machine, and it's actually a very good port. So of course, ZX Spectrum graphics are very colourful, and I think that reflects the actual arcade machine it's copying, those neon colours, that type of thing. Now, some of you will look at this gameplay and think to yourself, this should have been lower down the list. But I think this game is really nice to play. It does have a small screen, but it's so smooth, and it is slightly crammed, but it's definitely not too bad. And by crammed, I mean there's a lot of enemies to tackle. But like I say, given the machine's limitations and a little bit of sprite flicker here and there, it really is a fantastic port. And if you're a ZX Spectrum fan, I'm pretty sure you would have played this one back in the day. It's highly rated with ZX Spectrum fans. It's a really great port of R-Type. Next up on the list, we have got another microcomputer's port of R-Type. This is the MSX. So a lot of people in Britain didn't have an MSX back in the day. A lot of people had ZX Spectrum or C64. However, MSX users could play R-Type. Now, it's not a bad port, but as you can see from the gameplay on the screen right now, there is lag. The sprites are moving fantastic, very good in fact, but MSX moving is a bit of a limitation of the machine itself from my experience of playing MSX games in the past. So overly playable game, and it does suffer with the frame rate given the hardware limitations, but it does actually have music and sound effects. I think the music sounds a little bit like the Sega Master System's version, which I'm going to be looking at fairly soon, and it's also improvised on sprites used to other versions. For example, the MSX version, there's more mechs than on the other versions, and it's also got a full screen. So really, all in all, the MSX version of R-Type really isn't that bad. The only big issue I got with it is the actual lag, but like I say, that's really down to the machine hardware itself, and that couldn't be helped. Next up, we have got the Commodore 64 version of R-Type. Again, just like the other microcomputer versions, this one also released in 1988. I didn't have this one back in the day, and of course the C64 was my first ever system I owned, but I knew about this game a couple of years later in the arcades. Now, as a massive C64 fanboy, I'm afraid to say this one doesn't get any higher up in my list in this. Now, the reason for this is that although it's got some very awesome music in it produced by the SID chip, with sound effects too, it seriously sacrifices some parts of the game, such as some sprites are missing, and that circle, what you see halfway through the first stage, it doesn't actually spin, and I think that's what made R-Type's first stage something very special. That spinning wheel which is shooting at you, by far is one of the hardest versions of R-Type that I've played, and it does suffer with slight sprite flicker, but again, just like other microcomputers, that's a limitation of the hardware, where so many things is happening on screen all at once. Next up in the list, we have got the Game Boy Color's port of R-Type. So this one actually released around 11 years after the arcades game came out back in 1999. Now, like I say, going back to the original Game Boy port of this, some ports, especially on portable systems, are very impressive, and the Game Boy Color's port of this is no exception. That's why this one's halfway through this list. It's got great performance with very little lag in it. Sound effects and music is also included. Very fluid gameplay. There is some sacrifices with sprites, but we can allow that for limitations, just like microcomputers had limitations. But for what it is, a portable system, is a very, very nice release of R-Type, and I was really impressed with this version of it. Next up in my list, we have got the Sega Master System's port of R-Type. This one released back in 1988 alongside the microcomputers releases of this. Something which was really impressive to me is such responsive gameplay, and it was very smooth to play too. It also came with music as well as sound effects, and it's got such a nice field to exploring with your spaceship. Nothing's too crammed in the game like the Atari ST version, and the sprites are just very nicely sized. It's a really faithful port to the arcade source. Next up, we have got the Commodore Amiga's port of R-Type. This one released in 1989, and of course at the time it would have been competing against the Atari ST, and we know where the Atari ST's port of R-Type ended on my list. So what made this version much better than the Atari ST's version was everything really. It had a nice feel to play, and unlike the Atari ST's port of it, the sprites in this version was actually nicely done. They weren't too big, and the gameplay wasn't too fast, and that's why I've ranked the Amiga's version so high up in this list. It's a very nice port, and I think all Commodore Amiga fans would have played this one back in 1989, 1990. I would have been really chuffed with this port of R-Type if I had an Amiga, if I was fortunate enough to have an Amiga back in the day. Next up in the list, we have got a version of R-Type which a lot of people might not have played or known about, but this one is for the PC Engine or TurboGrafx CD. So one standout feature of this version of R-Type is its rendition of the theme music, the Stage 1 music. It's got its own unique take on it with some nice piano sound in the background, and of course, like most iconic games, music is just important as gameplay itself, and that's where this version really stands out. And music is awesome. On top of that, it's got really nice vibrant visuals with neon colors when you're shooting things. It's really nice, and it's a very faithful to the arcade original despite the music being different. Despite that, it's a superb version of it, and I highly recommend any R-Type fan or shoot 'em up fan to play this version. It's also got no sprite flicker either, so it's a win-win with this one. Now, back in 1989, if you happen to have had a Sharp X68000, if you was in the west of the world and not in Japan, you would have realised at that point that the R-Type port of this was near arcade perfection 100%. It's certainly one of the most difficult games out of all of these versions of R-Type to play. I really did struggle with this port of R-Type. It was really ramped up, and the really good feature with this particular port of it is that you have the ability to change between difficulty modes, and even the easiest mode on this version of it was hard as nails. It wasn't easy to play. Having said that, it was near arcade perfection, and for anyone who's yet to experience Sharp X68000, it's a superb Japanese microcomputer from the 1980s, and it's highly worth checking out. And at first place in this countdown, I ranked the PlayStation, OG PlayStation's version of R-Type. This is on the R-Types disc, and this one, just like the Sharp X68000, is near arcade perfection. The only reason this one actually won the first place is just a matter over difficulty level. The PS1 version of R-Type, the difficulty level was really toned down. It's a little bit more playable. But like I say, the Sharp X68000 version of this was insanely difficult, even at the easiest level of difficulty. So that's it. What do you think of my choices? What would you have ranked in first place? Or, you know, do you think Atari ST deserved a higher place than what I actually placed it? Anyways, let us know in the comments what you actually think of this, and give us some feedback.